Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I realize with all the current events that are taking place, there might be a perception that we are not covering as much material as we probably should. So, with the realization that some people have the ACT tomorrow, I am going to record the remainder of the timeline lecture, which may be lengthy, so that everybody can be on the same page and everyone gets the exact same lecture. So, just to pull us all back, we have talked about the social contract, the idea that society gives up its individuals in the society give up its power to someone in exchange for their protection. And John Locke took it one step further, that when a society feels that their rights are not being protected, they have the ability to revolt and overthrow and put in a new government that will provide protection of its God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. We started to go back and talk about the problems that the colonists had with Great Britain. And we talked about how Parliament started to put into place some taxes that the colonies paid for, but those who remained in Great Britain did not pay the same taxes. So we talked a little bit about the Stamp Act, the Sons of Liberty being formed. This being our first interest group, it was a group of individuals who were not loyalists to Great Britain, and knew that there had to be a change coming forth in order for the colonies to survive. We talked about the Townshend Act and the Boston Massacre. We have covered information on the Tea Act as well. We also talked a little bit about the Boston Tea Party and some of the history behind the Boston Tea Party. When we talked about the First Continental Congress, a lot of times this is not identified in history as such, but members, representatives of the colonies came together to start talking about what they realized was coming, that Great Britain was abusing those in the colonies. And so they started talking about, if we want to hit Great Britain where it truly will upset them the most, we need to go after the economics. So let's do a boycott. Let's make sure all colonies are in the same boat and we're all doing this. And then that started that idea of, let's write down what exactly it is that we feel has happened to us, and what the colonists felt Great Britain was doing against the colonies. We talked about the Revolutionary War, the idea that still to this day, there's no given proof on who fired the first shot. The Second Continental Congress, I believe this is where we left off. The Second Continental Congress came together once the war started. And this time it was to not discuss what they're going to do going forward as far as resisting Great Britain, but how are they going to continue to fight, literally fight against Great Britain. So the two major matters on the table for that meeting was, how are we going to defend ourselves against a very well supplied, a powerful military. And the agreement that they finally came up with is that there wouldn't be necessarily people directed to fight, but there would definitely be some sort of militia. Militia is just a citizen army coming together from each of the colonies to defend the rights that they truly believe belong to the colonists. And then the next question is, if we're going to have all these citizen armies, how is it then that we're going to defend it and be unified? And they agreed that George Washington needed to be that particular leader over all of the citizen armies throughout the colonies. Even after they started the war and they agreed to a militia in each of the colonies, um, there was still hope that there could be some sort of peaceful agreement to settle this dispute. And so the colonies came together with the idea that maybe if we reach back out to King George and we ask for forgiveness, and we reiterate that we are all British, we all come from the same location, all backing the same values, that maybe King George would, forget the problems that they'd had and see the colonies as an extension of Great Britain. But as we know history, we also know that King George basically says no. You started the war, we'll end the war, and it'll be on our terms. Moving forward, um, we have this idea of, is this really going to end peacefully? And Thomas Paine comes forward with his writing, and as we've talked about, he identifies and says that you cannot have a society without some sort of organized law and order and direction. And as he says, government is the necessary evil. If we're going to survive as society, a government is necessary, even though society or human beings would love to have and exist without rules. But he says that basically the colonies need to wise up, open their eyes, and realize this is not going to end well. And if they don't declare the independence, um, there's no matter what they do, if they don't agree to this, King George, as seen through previous examples, is not just going to give up willingly. So that's where we end up with the major declaration. There's a lot of dispute over who put these words down, but it's not even argued that the final version, the one that is in the archives in Washington, D.C., the final version of the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. And the excuse me, I apologize. The Declaration of Independence is actually broken into three parts. The first part is basically the introduction. What is the purpose? It's kind of like the thesis statement. And it's just a reminder of what they've known, even through the social contract, learning from writings that existed long before this country was even considered, to the point where they are moving forward, is that men are equal. Men are, and the idea, this is where we see the change, that we are all born with God-given rights. And this is where Thomas Jefferson changes a little bit of the language, as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes would have identified it as life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changes it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The idea that we all have the right to pursue our livelihood, essentially. Um, and there has been question of whether or not this should be changed, because all men are created equal, and they meant literally all white men were created equal. Women weren't considered to be part of that equality, neither were slaves as at that point in time. Then, after this introduction is given, the colonists, or the writers of the Declaration and the final author, Thomas Jefferson, they start writing 27 different things they consider that King George has done wrong to them. This is where my OCD will always kick in. And I'm like, okay, 27, you couldn't have ended at 25, or you couldn't have gotten it to 30. I'm always one that has to end on a 5 or a 0. But they ended up with 27 issues that they claim was done to the colonies that wasn't done equally to those who still lived in Great Britain. And then the final declaration that we declare this to declare ourselves to be free and independent states. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that when they talk about a state, that if we look up the definition of a state in the dictionary, a state is going to have something very similar, and I put also known as, but it's something similar to what the definition of a country would be, what the definition of a kingdom would be, what the different definition of a nation is. And so the definition of a state is an independent political unit. Simple definition. But at the point of the Declaration of Independence, they were looking at the idea that we had 13 independent political units. So essentially, they were saying out of this grouping of colonies was the creation of 13 basically nations. So they saw themselves essentially as every state being its own country, that it could have its own rules, that it could have its own laws within its boundaries. So once we declare this, and of course, Great Britain doesn't recognize July 4th as the date of our independence, that comes much later, that they will recognize it, we have to have another convention. And the convention, and I see I have all these things on here that I will explain here in a second, or whoops, sorry. I whoops, I did it again. Sounding like a little bit like, and then I go and delete it. Okay, so I'm just going to leave them there. So the Third Continental Congress comes about, and it's not, can we get King George to be more lenient to the colonies, or what is our military going to look like? Now it is, we've declared ourselves independent. Now it is, we need to actually have some sort of government. Considering that we're 13 individual states, we have to consider a couple of options. Now I'm going to add this in here and explain to you what these mean. All right, so when we were under British rule, there was what we would identify as the central government, and that was Great Britain. And Great Britain and we understand we had the 13 colonies. Nothing about the size. I mean, obviously, you see, I can't regulate the size here right now. But when we look at who held power, it was Great Britain holding all the power and all the say over the colonies. So Great Britain would make a decision, and they would dictate what exactly it was that the colonies would do. So as far as having an idea of government, Great Britain held all the power, and they pushed their values, their rules down onto the colonies, and that was known as a unitary form of government. Okay, rule from one direction. Okay, power was held in the hands of one. So Great Britain, again, holding all the power. So when they come together for this, how do we organize our government moving forward? They knew that this was not going to be an option, because this is what they had just literally done. And so with the new government, what I will do is I'll clone this page and I will go to this next one. They being those members at that meeting, made the decision that because Great Britain no longer exists, and we can take Great Britain completely out of this picture, and that doesn't work, so let me try it this way. It should work. I don't know why this isn't working. Okay, so we're just going to delete that, and we'll get rid of that. So now we no longer have Great Britain, so we don't even have these lines anymore, because there's power not coming from any. They decide that because they're independent of each other, so we know that there would technically be 13 of these, and I don't think I need to create 13 of these, but each of these representing an individual, once colony, now state. The question is, how do we coexist with each other and continue to fight against Great Britain because they haven't recognized our independence. And so Ben Franklin at this meeting comes forward and he says the answer to how we move forward is actually right in front of us. And he goes and he takes an arrow, and in this particular meeting he takes literal bow and arrow and he breaks one in half, and he says this represents one of our states. So this could represent Massachusetts or North Carolina or Maryland. And he says, but if we look at this arrow as one, it's weak. He says, but take a look at this group that already exists here in our new United States based on where we're going. He says, take a look at the Iroquois. He says the Iroquois live in territory that exists and overlaps to where some of the colonies, former colonies, are. He says the Iroquois is the name of 5 nations. And you have all of these individual tribes that belong to this grouping. And he says, if we consider one of them as we do one arrow, the Seneca alone could defend themselves, but maybe not entirely against other groups. He says, however, if you combine and you look at the 5 tribes that make up the League of Iroquois, and you put those 5 tribes together, and you move all of these arrows, and he took 5 arrows, and he said, you put them all together. And he does this example in this meeting, and he says, one arrow by itself is weak, but when you put 5 of them together, he says, they become a much stronger grouping. And so he says, we already have the answer to going forward. He says, the answer going forward is that we combine ourselves into what we call a confederation, a grouping, a common group together forming a very powerful unit. And so going back to these circles that we had here, we're no longer unitary. He says we need to really consider being a confederate system. And what that essentially means is that we will have some sort of central government. And as a central government, we'll just identify this as central government. But essentially what they're saying is this government it's there, but it's not really going to exist. We're going to have some rules, we're going to have some thought to how this government runs, but essentially it's the states that are going to decide instead how much power this central government's going to have. And if the states, 13 of them, decide that the central government is going to be limited, that's how the process is going to be. So the power rested inside all these groups. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So we went from the unitary system where power is resting in the central government and all decisions are being handed down to the colonies, to flipping that to having a central government, but the power is resting in the hands of the subunits, or in this case, the states. So the question then became, what do we do going forward? If we're going to be in some sort of agreement of the states, what is that going to look like? And so I'm going to actually end this particular video here, and then I will pick up the next one and start going through the Articles of Confederation.